It looks like something conjured from a dream, or perhaps an extravagant dare. Alexandra, if you had to describe the Royal Pavilion in just 3 words, what would they be?
Romantic, picturesque, enchanting.
And those words only begin to scratch the surface of an extraordinary royal residence where history, scandal, and architectural genius collide. To find out more about the Royal Pavilion, I'm thrilled to be talking today with the building's leading expert, Dr. Alexandra Loske, curator of the Royal Pavilion and Historic Properties. Alexandra, the Royal Pavilion stands as one of Britain's most remarkable and eccentric buildings. What is it about this extraordinary party palace that even 2.5 centuries on from its foundation continues to astound us?
I think it's a building that looks like no other building in this country, and it's almost like a mirage that appears, out of the urban cityscape here in Brighton. Remember, this is not open countryside, this is an urban environment. Dreamlike, with its spires and turrets and onion-shaped domes. And you're not quite sure what it is. Even today, people are a little bit confused by it. But that was all deliberate. It was very much of the time, a romantic building that was meant to draw you in and make you think about what could possibly come next after those Indian-inspired exteriors. And
it's designed to bewilder and beguile.
Bewildering is a really good word. There's no straight paths to the door. You don't even know where the entrance is. You have to find your way to this magical, bewildering palace, which was never called a palace when it was first built. It was always called a pavilion, and you had to get to it via winding paths. It is typical of the Regency, but it's also very unusual. It's such an extreme example of that playfulness, the picturesque with a capital P, where, every time you turn or you approach the building, via those winding paths, you get another view, another vista, and you don't quite know where it begins and where it ends. So it's magical. It looks as if it has floated in. And then you walk inside and things change again and you encounter something quite unexpected.
As curator, you've dedicated a significant part of your career to this audacious building, and now you are the expert on the pavilion, are you not? In fact, I think you have a new book out published by Yale University Press, the first in-depth study of the building to have been written since the 1980s. What is it about the Royal Pavilion that first captured your imagination and drew you into its unique world?
The pavilion was sort of given to me like a gift. I received a doctoral scholarship based here, and I was asked to look into the interiors mainly, but predominantly how colour was used in this building. So I became a researcher, which gave me sort of an access to all the archives and all the materials and, open doors behind the scenes. So I sort of spent time with the building like few people can for several years, and then became a curator and have now written this book about it.
And there's obviously so much to discover because you've kept on researching.
Yes, I never stop, and it's a building that you never fully understand. Each curator before me, each author who's written about the book before me has tried, but it is a building still full of mysteries. It's a very complex building. There are some spaces that even I have not seen. And it still has secrets, and we are missing certain things like the original architectural plans. So there's still a lot to discover.
I wonder if anyone's ever really understood it, apart from perhaps the genius behind it all, King George IV.
Yes, I would like to look into his head.
Wouldn't
Very
we all?
much so. It's very much an expression of his mind and his vision. But let us not forget, he could also afford to turn these visions into reality. So he had the means to come up with something as fantastical as this, whatever it costs. But also the people who built it for him. There is the great John Nash, probably as creative and inventive as George. He was the architect. But also the interior designers or decorators, as they were called. Incredible artists who sort of realised these ideas that George had.
The Brighton Pavilion really is a mirage conjured from vision and nerve. And yet, here we are in Brighton by the coast, and just over the channel, chaos reigned during the French Revolution. The guillotine. Can you imagine that George's peers, the aristocrats and royalty, had only a few years earlier had their heads chopped off? So it's remarkable, isn't it, to think that things are so different here, just the other side of this narrow strip of brine. Alexandra, when I was an art student, I loved looking at those Regency cartoons by artists like Thomas Rowlandson and James Gilray, whose not exactly flattering depictions show often a rather corpulent, bibulous prince. I've also read that George first came to Brighton for a sea cure. What exactly was this sea cure, and what did George hope it would achieve for him?
It is true, George first came to Brighton ostensibly to take the waters, as it was called. So it was a good excuse for George, and clearly he needed some sort of, help with his various ailments. But he was also a very young man. He was still quite fit. He did come down on horseback, and it was probably also a way of getting away from the strict London court life. He famously did not get on well with his father, King George III, and coming to Brighton was a nice relief. And of course, he first comes when he had just turned 21, so he had come of age, so he can do what he likes. Where does he go? Brighton, to take the waters. But there's not just the waters here, there's also his disreputable uncle, who can sort of introduce him to the right places. And seaside resorts were sort of full of life and culture, gambling, the right sort of like-minded people, theatres, libraries, the racecourse, of course. So George indulged here under the pretense that it was really only for his health.
So what a pretext. And that explains why the building doesn't exactly resemble a sanatorium or a spa. It's doing something else, isn't it?
Well, it was always meant to be a getaway place. I'm convinced about that. And first, in the first few years when he was here, he rented a very modest house, and then clearly liked the place so much that he wanted something more permanent, and he engaged in 1786 a famous architect called Henry Holland. And Henry Holland built George a neoclassical pavilion by the sea. It wasn't exactly modest, but it's not what you see now. It was an elegant, sort of classical-looking building, symmetrical, with a shallow dome in the middle, which is still there, it's just hidden. And at some point it even had sort of classical figures lined up on the roof.
That would have had a completely different set of associations around it as a style. If sort of neoclassicism makes me think of, it is very elegant. It's a refined visual style, but it also, with its reference to the ancient world and its visual language, talks about a kind of restraint.
Yes, a tasteful restraint. So not at all what you see now. And inside and outside, we also know it had a sort of pastel-y coloured, chalky, finished interior, classical interior. It was a fine building, and of course it inspired many other buildings in town. So tall, classically inspired townhouses going up. And crucially, it introduced not bay but bow windows to capture as much light as possible. There were a whole wing, the north and the south wing had sort of a double bow frontage. And you see that repeated in many, many buildings in Brighton.
And it was white.
It was a sort of cream colour. It was called buff and with blue shutters, so blue and buff. Incidentally, also the political colours of the Whig Party.
Was that to irritate his dad?
Oh yes, of course.
Why would that have wound the king up?
Because they famously didn't get on, father and son. One was very conservative and traditional. Allegedly, or pretending to live a frugal life, which is hard to do as the King of England, but he could at least pretend. I think in spirit, those two were very, very different. He got on much better with his mother.
I read that a contemporary of George's described how he could drink, wench, and swear like a man who at all times would prefer a girl and a bottle to politics and a sermon.
Yes, there are many great, great quotes about George, and no doubt he was a questionable character at times. He was incredibly vain. He was, a spendthrift, but he was also incredibly charming and educated and generous as well. So I'm sure he would have made a really good drinking companion.
And we know that towards the end of his life, his fast living contributed to some medical problems. And these were famously lampooned, cruelly lampooned, in fact, by the caricaturists of the age. There's a strong sense in these that the key figures often embody their entire nation in their manner and appearance. And I wonder if there was a political purpose to George's personal grandeur, but particularly after the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Do you think his extravagances, this pavilion being chief amongst them, served a purpose in projecting Britain's greatness?
I think it's a really interesting point, and I've got to start by saying we simply don't know what George's intentions were. There's almost no correspondence left that gives us any inkling about why he went Indian on the outside, Chinese inspired on the inside. He doesn't give it away. No letters survive and no correspondence between the architects and designers and George. However, we can put a lot of things together and make educated guesses, because he keeps coming down to watch the installment of new Chinese wallpaper. He orders people to come down immediately to make some changes. There's a little sketchbook with lots of little designs by John and Frederick Crace, his key interior decorators. And a later member of the Crace family has put a note in it saying this book was often looked on by George IV. So he clearly said, I want this, I want this, I want this. Really very much involved with the creation of this place. As for the political commentary with this, George was a Francophile. He was probably quite obsessed with Napoleon. Eventually, Napoleon gets defeated, and that makes George, when he is Prince Regent, so at a different stage in his power, shall we say, one of the most influential and powerful men of Europe, if not the most influential man. But introducing this sort of Chinese and Indian style here we have no proof, may have been also George trying to not appear to be too Francophile. So, French classicism underpins this building, and you see it if you look closer. And there's also a lot of French chinoiserie in here, or was at least. But then, while the Napoleonic Wars are raging, it is possible that he tried to do something else. And it suited him quite well, because this is Brighton, this is his party palace, this is his getaway place. Here he can experiment more than in other places.
A party palace, erected at the command of an indebted prince, addicted to extravagant living and utterly oblivious to the turmoil gripping Europe.
this. So I think all these things come in together, and what you said about the French Revolution just behind them. And George would have seen the aristocrats coming, literally washing up here, fleeing France. And he may have thought a little bit along the lines of, well, what next for Britain? My head might roll, so I might as well enjoy life while I can and go over the top. So I think there's elements of all of this in this building.
So you think he was living fast because he really might die young?
I think he was an intelligent man, and seeing what was happening in France would have made him think, reflect on what might happen here.
But George must have been a remarkably self-possessed and confident man. He would have known that the Chinese style is associated with effeminacy.
Yeah.
And he didn't care.
No, he didn't. He liked it. I think he liked it. And he saw this style first in his mother's collection and in his aunt's collection. So he saw this, being embraced in the female sphere. His sisters did very similar things, and some things perhaps predated some of the interiors here at Frogmore House in Windsor Great Park, but they did it on a much smaller scale. So he sees what his mother's collecting and what his sisters are doing, creating sort of lacquer panelled rooms, and then he does it in the music room on such a scale that you can no longer use lacquer. You have to imitate lacquer on canvas.
And presumably he would have known what people thought. He probably saw caricatures of him as a decadent satrap reclining in a oriental interior while his kingdom is threatened by France.
Yeah.
He would have seen pictures of him falling over drunk in the kitchen in a feast, and he probably heard what people said as well. There's an incredible quote that I came across from Princess Lieven, the wife of the Russian ambassador, who said in 1822 that, "I do not believe that since the days of Heliogabalus there have been such magnificence and luxury. There is something effeminate in it which is disgusting."
Yes.
Extraordinary.
Devil take me. I think she's also quoting somebody else, but she was here. She was at those parties. She was sort of lying on those cushions, half comatose, clearly very drunk. She was a very sharp-tongued sort of commentator.
Yeah.
But it gives it a real sense of what was going on here.
And the reference to Heliogabalus is hardly flattering. We're talking about a decadent, one of the most decadent Roman emperors.
Yes. And and George, of course, he knew about the caricatures, and sometimes he would buy them up or try and buy up all copies. Impossible, of course. But for us today, I think it's fabulous having both the commissioned portraits that he, of course, monitored and he wanted himself to be shown in a particular flattering way, and then have the contrast of the caricatures, who are also extreme. So we have those two extremes, and I think that's only right and necessary.
Yes.
In its early days, the Brighton Pavilion was a relatively modest lodging house. Let's discover the stages by which it is transformed into the remarkable spectacle that we can see today.
So, Alexandra, what we can see today is not the first incarnation of the building, is it?
No, it's not the first, it's not even the second. It's a multi-layered, multifaceted building with a very complex history, but it isn't in quite a contained space. So it's smaller than you think. And this is the genius of John Nash, of course, giving us this impression of a sprawling Indian-inspired palace in a large garden, which of course it isn't. We are sort of hemmed in by Brighton, the now city, then a thriving fishing town. And when George first came, He wanted to be right at the centre of the action, where the new libraries were going up, where Dr. Russell had his place. Dr. Russell is the one who sort of turned Brighton into a reputable seaside resort. And he wanted to be seen as well.
Was Dr. Russell, I imagine he was a physician.
Yes, yeah. Physician who had moved from Lewes to Brighton, and he set up house just down the road from here. But George wanted to be at the centre of it all, where the theatres were, the libraries. And so he chose a house on what is now called the Old Steine. And this is the sort of rocky plateau where the fishermen used to sort of pull up the catch of the day and dry their nets. By the 1780s, it had become the parading ground of the rich and famous. And that's where George lives. That's where he rents a modest house. This is the 1780s, and he's also using it as a hideaway with his lover at the time, Maria Fitzherbert, who becomes his illegal wife, of course.
Well, a legal wife? How do you become an illegal wife?
Well, you become an illegal wife if you're living in the 1780s, you're the future King of England, and you don't ask your father permission to marry.
Right.
She was also, Maria, formidable woman, much respected in society. She had been married twice before, so she was twice widowed. Not suitable material for the future King of England. And she was a Roman Catholic.
Okay, that makes sense. I understand now why that was an illegal marriage.
That makes it illegal in the eyes of the Anglican Church and the royal family at the time. But he clearly liked Brighton so much. It was such a convenient place, a fun place to come to. You could do the journey in a day and back, but usually he stayed for several weeks. He wanted something more permanent. So in 1787, Henry Holland builds this first proper structure, incorporating that first house. And this really beautiful structure goes up within 3 months. It has foundations, it's brick, it's got a proper brick structure. And it is hung with the famous mathematical tiles, which are sort of typical of this area.
How are they mathematical?
They're mathematical because they pretend to be glazed brickwork or unglazed in some cases. They give an extra layer of protection to the structure, but they sort of slot into each other. It's not a very complex, but it's a hanging system. So you hang them. They have holes. They slot into each other, and they hang on either a wooden structure or on.
So it's like lap work, almost.
Yes, but it's really tight, and it is glazed tiles, although ours weren't glazed. But you get them in different colours, and when they're glazed, they shimmer and shine. It's very typical of this area.
Sounds like the scales of a serpent.
Yeah, it is a bit like scales. Beautiful, really beautiful. So it sits there gleaming, elegant, quite restrained by George's standards. And this building is here until 1815, with a few modifications. He adds a few wings in the very early days of the 19th century. And this is when something seems to switch in his head. And we don't know why. And it may be trying to appear not too Francophile, trying out things. But also I think Brighton does that to you. It makes you more playful with, and if you're the future King of England, you become more playful with the architecture. You build things. And the first thing George builds on a really, really ambitious scale on this site is new stables for his horses and a riding house. And he had quite modest ones to the south of the building. And then in 1803, a man called William Porden is engaged, and he creates what is now called the Dome, a huge domed structure, in fact, the largest in this country, apart from St. Paul's Cathedral at the time, with room for his horses. And this is at the northern edge of the Pavilion estate. And it has Moorish features on the outside.
So we're talking Moorish is like North African?
North African, some Middle Eastern, some sort of ogee tip windows. And
an ogee is that sort of S-shaped curve.
Yes, it goes like this. and has tips. And it makes it look terribly romantic and like something unusual and not British, basically. And it's a huge building. It sort of dominates the skyline of Brighton. It also dominates George's actual pavilion, the Marine Pavilion, as it was then called. A really, really ambitious structure. So clearly he starts thinking about, what can I do with the pavilion? What can I change here? How can I catch up with my horses?
Yes, you don't want to be outclassed
No.
by your ride, do you? I mean,
No. So he sort of had to catch up with his stables, but that was not easily done. And there's some really fascinating attempts or designs that are proposed by William Porden, by Henry Holland, by a man called Humphrey Repton, and this is all happening in the first few years of the 19th century. And all these designs are heavily Chinese-inspired, with hipped roofs and the building painted blue and red. And none of this is built. And I think that is the Napoleonic Wars. That Britain is at war. Getting building materials is difficult, and George can't quite at that point display quite that much excess.
that could have been politically dangerous.
Absolutely, yeah. And he was only the Prince of Wales at the time. So all of that gets put on hold. But what he does is he starts changing the interiors in a way that's less visible. It's only visible to the people he invites to stay here. But in 1802, he engages John and Frederick Crace, a really sort of famous family firm of interior decorators. And clearly commissioned by George, they introduce emphatically coloured, very bold chinoiserie schemes into the building. So out go the sort of pastel colours, the classical interiors that we know were here, and in come really bold colours, surface finishes, export art brought here by the East India Company all the way from China. It's all happening on the inside, whereas the outside remains as is for another sort of 13, 14 years.
So you mentioned that the palette changed and that there were these bolder colours coming in. And you also talked about the dome and the fact this was a very large structure. And I wonder if, because the Regency period was a time of, well, I mean, let's think about Europe as a whole, amazing kind of political and intellectual ferment. And also imperialism, expansion of a sort of horizon of experience in many ways. And I imagine also technological innovation. And I wonder if science has much to do with the dome or the pigments and what may have been possible.
Yes, very much so. I mean, let's not forget it is the especially the late 18th century and then going into the 19th century. It's the time when we actually take off. We literally take off. Hot air balloons are invented in the late 80s. So for the first time, we get a little bit of a distant perspective of our planet. It's absolutely fascinating. But also it's the beginning of electricity. It's not the invention, but the beginning of the understanding of meteorology. It's the age of cloud classification and classification in general, wanting to understand how the world is structured. It's also the great age of exploration. But if you then zoom into this building and George's mind, you see him in a rather selfish way, an indulgent way, embrace new technologies. He's just before proper steam power. That changes Victoria's world, really, Queen Victoria's world. But George does embrace anything that's new and experimental. So yes, he does let William Porden create the biggest domed structure using wood and iron, and people didn't know whether it would stay up. And another dome structure in Brighton collapses within a few weeks, let us not forget. Mm-hmm.
So That's extraordinary. I mean, do you think he felt... What about his guests? Do you think they felt safe?
Well, not all of them felt safe, because even just what John Nash does from 1815 onwards, so transforming this building like, nobody else before him, adding the two grand rooms at the north and the south end, and they have these sort of tent-shaped roofs. They're complex roofs, and it means you can't hang anything and then lower the chandelier. You can't hang chandeliers and then lower them. They just hang there. And it's a really complex design or, measurement. And we can't add anything to the weight of these chandeliers because the roof might just cave in. So not everybody felt safe, because sitting under the largest object in this building, which is the dragon chandelier in the banqueting room, did cause some guests to feel, oh my God, worried about it coming crashing down.
Sure, you worry less about your gout and more about your impending mortality sat under that, wouldn't you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's a chandelier that weighs a ton, and it's seemingly held in the claws of a dragon flapping about at the ceiling, which of course it isn't. That's an optical illusion or decorative illusion. But yes, some guests asked to be sat not directly underneath that chandelier. George being George, if he wanted, for example, a red room, which is not unusual in itself, but if you want a really intense red that looks a bit like lacquer panels in a room, well, you just have to buy the pigments that give you this effect. And that would be the best Chinese vermilion. And that's in the account box. I wonder whether it actually came from China, but it certainly alluded to the quality of that pigment. And he could buy it in big quantities. And you have what's called a highly saturated paint with a lot of raw pigment in it. But that is not enough. If you want that sort of glassy finish on the vermilion, you add another pigment, you add another layer of paint, and that was a transparent red, an organic red called cochineal, created from sort of ground up parasitic insects that would live on cacti in South America.
This red that you're alluding to is in the music room.
That is indeed in the music room.
And there's lots of it.
There's a lot. It must have been so expensive. And we have the account books, and it does say, vermilion red, chrome yellow, some other colours, and other expensive colours. So the crazes clearly buy the best of the best.
And here we are in Regency, England, and there's potentially vermilion coming from China, and these poor little beetles coming from South America to decorate a building in Brighton. Yeah. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah. And there's currently, of course, we need to look at the colonial story of that. And there's currently a lot of research going on into how colour travelled. Was it the colour? Was it the recipe? How did new colours travel? We also know that Prussian blue, which we have a lot of in this building, and that was a thoroughly European pigment invented in the early 18th century, that made it to the Far East and was used there in Japanese and Chinese art. And we're surrounded here by yellow, and this is probably the greatest example of George embracing new things, however much they cost, whatever will happen to them. George saw yellow arrive here in the form of export art and in images of Chinese imperial robes, so associated a strong yellow with Chinese imperial yellow. Yellow ground wallpaper came from China, so he wanted to decorate whole rooms in this colour. But strong yellows are rare until the early 19th century. They're really hard to source. Most yellows are sort of pale and ochre-y, so quite sort of subdued.
Like earth colours?
Ochre is an earth pigment, one of the oldest pigments. And there's some lead yellows, but what is lacking is a really strong, glowing yellow. And that becomes available in the early years of the 19th century. It's called chrome yellow. It's based on chrome out of iron. And George puts it on several walls in several rooms. So he really goes for this new chrome yellow, a chemical pigment, which is later on the pigment or the paint that Vincent van Gogh uses for his sunflowers, because it glows. But nobody knows what's going to happen to it. So will it fade? Will it go dark? George doesn't care. Let's have it. Whatever happens to it, we'll put it on the walls.
And yes, Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers and that being the same pigment, it's a remarkable coincidence, isn't it? Because wasn't the sunflower very much associated with King George IV?
I haven't thought of that. That's a really nice connection through the decades, really. Yes, so the sunflower is a recurring motif in this building, and we see it in many of the rooms, in many shapes and forms, but especially in the saloon, which was redecorated in 1823 by another great artist who was involved here, Robert Jones. And that was the room which had some really bold Chinese-inspired interior schemes. And then come the 1820s and George is king, he thinks, I've got to tone it down a bit. Although when you look at it, it doesn't look toned down, but it's more regal than the previous schemes. It's still very intensely coloured with this sort of geranium red and gold silk in the soft furnishing and the curtains, of course. And a lot of gold, a lot of silver in combination, and sunflowers everywhere, including on the carpets as the main central motif. And there's various reasons for that, one of them being George's Francophilia, his love of all things French. So he wanted to associate himself with Louis XIV, the French Sun King. So it pops up in many different places.
So he sees himself kind of like a sun king, but he can't actually choose the sun as his emblem because that's been taken, so he picks the sunflower instead.
Yeah. There's difference of heraldic emblems associated with him. Mm-hmm.
Extraordinary. And he must have had a radiant personality, so perhaps it's fitting.
Oh, yeah. I think he was probably a very, very charming and persuasive man who could throw a good party.
So here we are in Brighton on the coast, and just over the sea is Britain's great rival France. In terms of what was going on in Europe at this time, both politically and artistically, I want to discover how the Royal Pavilion is distinctive. Alexandra, the pavilion's patron, Prince George, was, in his youth, as you've said, quite the Francophile. So why isn't this building more in tune with, say, French Rococo or perhaps neoclassical taste?
Yes, like many, many people, George was quite fascinated by the figure of Napoleon, but perhaps more importantly, he loved the French arts and design and architecture. The first place where he sort of dabbled in interior decoration and architecture was actually his residence in London. That was called Carlton House. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was there that he was indeed playing with sort of Rococo, French Rococo-inspired interiors, including chinoiserie interiors. And then when he comes to Brighton, still in his 20s, that first building that he commissioned, that he lives in here by Henry Holland, that is very much in the French neoclassical style.
That's the Marine Pavilion.
That was called the Marine Pavilion. So we're talking sort of the mid-late 1780s. And it has all the hallmarks of the classical, tasteful, elegant style. This sort of cream, almost white exterior, the symmetry. You have a north wing and east wing, and a circular, almost circular saloon in the centre with a flat neoclassical dome and some neoclassical figures and a colonnade. And that is very much what the pavilion looks like for several years, from 1787 until, externally, 1815.
So then what happens?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, on the inside, George is already going Chinese. He uses Chinese export art and puts in a lot of high-quality Asian porcelain, usually mounted in spectacular sort of gilt bronze mounts. And he doesn't quite know what to do with the outside. He knows he wants to change something because he has built these, impressive stables, new stables, and he has to sort of catch up with that. And he discards the idea of a Chinese exterior. And I think he does so because he wants a bit more surprise and a bit more contrast. If the building had been Chinese on the outside and then also Chinese on the inside, that wasn't good enough for George. I think he wanted that element of surprise. So Humphrey Repton in 1806 suggests something more Indian-inspired, but he doesn't get the job. So the plans, the proposals survive, but it was never built. And George has to wait until 1815 and until he can really, really go for it. And of course, by then, Napoleon had been defeated. And also John Nash was on the scene. And George was by then the Prince Regent. So his father, King George III, had been declared unfit to rule, the madness of King George. So our George becomes he's king in all but name. He's in charge. He can do what he likes. And Napoleon has been defeated. So that's when he engages John Nash, who, by the way, at the same time is rebuilding half of London.
Yes, you've got Regent Street.
Regent Street, Regent's Park.
Yeah.
So all of that. And he also engages him to make great, great changes to Buckingham Palace. So what does John Nash do? Well, first of all, really importantly, he does not pull down the existing building. So Henry Holland's neoclassical Marine Pavilion is still here, by and large. Instead, he extends. It's his take on a house extension. So he adds the two grandest and also largest rooms in the building, and that's at the north end, what is now the music room, and at the south end, the spectacular banqueting room. And they're sort of box-shaped. They're sort of square, large rooms with sort of tent-shaped roofs, which are spectacular. And then in the middle, and there's a short period until about 1818 where those extensions exist. And in the middle, you still see Henry Holland's building with the flat dome in the middle. And then John Nash adds the now very famous bulbous domes, including the largest one in the centre, and that sits on top of Henry Holland's sort of French-inspired flat dome.
So the saloon is like a small neoclassical building, and it's got an onion dome on top.
Yes, it does. How does he do it? How does he create that extraordinarily complex roofline, that sort of Indian-inspired silhouette? Well, he uses a lot of cast iron. And that is, it might not sound unusual, but it is in the 1810s and 1820s, because we're just before the great railway age. We're just before Brunel, when cast iron is being used on an unimaginable scale, really, and changes the country. But here, John Nash uses cast iron to create these fantastical shapes, these, Indian-inspired shapes. So a lot of the minarets have iron cores. And in fact, the central onion dome, the really large one, which has rooms inside, which sits on the flat dome, that has a bird cage-like structure, which is cast iron. And there's a beautiful, luckily, although we don't have Nash's original design drawings for the building, the architectural drawings, we do have very, very good visual material from the 1820s, and in a book that John Nash himself published. And that you see in that book, because the book also includes cross-sections. So in the cross-section, you see the cast iron cores and the cage-like structures that give you that extraordinary roofline.
So this publication of Nash's, was it like a prospectus showing what he could do?
Well, it was showing what he can do, but it was much more than a prospectus. It's a really ambitious publishing venture, clearly supported by George IV, and it captures the building at its absolute peak in the 1820s, with a few earlier images as well, as high-quality aquatints, so coloured images, but also outline engravings with minute detail. It's the closest we have to architectural drawings, but there are very appealing images, and they show the building outside and inside. And I'm convinced that, yes, of course, it was Nash showing what he can do, and it's such an unusual-looking building, but it's also George adding this building to the canon of royal residences, because a few years earlier, a 3-volume set had been published called Pine's Royal Residences, which captured all the royal buildings with beautiful illustrations, but not the Royal Pavilion, quite possibly because there was so much building work going on here. So here's George, and he gives us his greatest, not largest, but greatest building. And it's a fabulous book. It's a big folio, and it was given, we think, to very special visitors as a sort of souvenir. Wow. But it's, to this day, is the most important visual sort of source we have, and that shows us how mainly John Nash's mind worked, but also shows the interiors at various stages. And we also use it when we have to repair or restore or recreate aspects of the building, outside and inside.
So it's your guide when you're restoring to make sure that your work is authentic?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes. In everything we do, if we want to go for historical accuracy, we look at the Nash views, and it has helped us, for example. So you can find individual objects. There's a pair of candelabra, French chinoiseries of Chinese figures playing music, and we know that they're French, but we also know they were in Carlton House in the 1790s, and then they moved here, and now they're at Buckingham Palace, so we can identify objects. This book helped us acquire the King's piano, which is downstairs in the music room gallery, because it came up at auction, and we found it in the books and the records, but we also found it in this book called Nash's Views, which was published in 1826.
So it enables you actually to place objects, individual items, in the context of the pavilion, and over time, as opportunity and resources enable, to bring that work back and and to recreate, the details of some of the decorations, columns, and it's used in a lot of restoration work as a reference, but also in my book. And we have some of the original watercolours for the aquatints as well. Yeah, and you mentioned earlier the role of the East India Company, which is not exactly free from controversy.
Oh, God, no.
So I want to look now at the way in which the pavilion appeals to the senses, to all of the senses. Because it really does. It seems to appeal to sight, sound, touch, and in its day, with the kitchens operating and the banqueting hall full of people and food, it must have appealed to taste. It really is the complete work of art. Like, in some ways, it makes me think of a Wagner opera, or maybe a great cathedral like Santiago de Compostela with the incense burning during a high mass. There's everything. You're totally immersed in that environment. So beyond architecture and interior design, the pavilion was also a stage for George's legendary feasts. At one stage, I understand about a quarter of the pavilion's ground plan was devoted to food. And a curious and influential figure in George's world of culinary spectacle was Antoine Carême, the French chef who famously aspired to be an architect. Nicknamed the Palladio of Patisserie after the legendary neoclassical architect Andrea Palladio, Carême was a master of elaborate sugar sculptures, towering confections designed to awe diners more often as art than sustenance. And I saw downstairs in the kitchen, there's this incredible menu. And it seems to me that the bit on the menu that Carême wants you to see is the section on pastries, right in the middle, sort of lower third of it. And there's a description of these actual buildings that he's made out of sugar. It's incredible.
Yes.
So Alexandra, Antoine Carême he worked for George, didn't he, from 1816. How did his approach to culinary display align with George IV's passion for grand feasting? And what was the role of the curiously named table decker's room?
Well, it is, as you say, it's extraordinary that such a relatively small royal residence gave over so much space to wining and dining. And I think that really tells you a lot about George. You know, he has a small party palace, which he never calls a palace, in Brighton. The largest rooms are devoted to wining and dining and to singing and dancing. So it really is a place for the senses. It's also a place where he wants to entertain people. He wants you to have a good time. And you're also right, the building draws you in, and it's extraordinarily well designed outside and inside to sort of lure you in, and you sink deeper and deeper into the carpets. You know, you start off on hard surfaces and then softer and softer, and then you sink into a real double pile carpet even in the banqueting room. And then what we have lost and what we can't recreate easily is the sounds and the scents. You know, the rooms were scented, and then in addition to that, you have all the smells and scents coming from the food, of course. And as for Carême, well, I think this is another indication of how much George actually liked French culture. Of course, he wants to have the most famous chef over from France. And he doesn't stay very long. We're not exactly sure whether he stayed a year or a year and a half, but he comes at that crucial time when John Nash is transforming everything, when he is creating what we now associate with the Royal Pavilion, including the addition of the wonderful banqueting room and the kitchen, that spectacular kitchen, which, by the way, is one of 9 kitchens.
9?
9.
In this,
so
right,
what visitors see today is the great kitchen, which George liked showing off. So he would sometimes bring people in, and it makes architecture and decorative nods to other areas in the building. It has similar columns with palm leaves and all that.
But that really struck me. That's unusual, right? Because why would you spend money on a kitchen?
It's really unusual, but it shows you how important food was to George. That kitchen is under construction when Carême comes. I wonder whether he was actually actively involved with that, whether he was able to cook in that kitchen. We're not quite sure, but he's certainly possibly shown in a picture in that book by Nash. So he may well have been the first chef to have cooked in that kitchen.
And there are some extraordinary innovations in the kitchen, aren't there? There's what looks like quite a contraption in front of the fire, presumably some kind of spit.
It's called a smoke jack, and yes, it's basically a very, very sophisticated spit roast. It's not the first one. I think there were earlier ones at Kew and other places, but it is, of course, it's great new technology using, again, cast iron, but using a fan system to keep them rotating. So you didn't need little children turning the spits.
A fan, so there's like a turbine in the chimney?
There's a fan system in the flue.
Wow.
So once it's going, it's going.
Right. Yeah.
And there's other things. There's a steam table in the middle, which you now know from certain restaurants.
What do you do with this?
A steam table was an oval table, which again you see in Nash's views. It doesn't survive, but we have something approximating it. So it's a wooden table covered in probably copper, because it conducts the heat very well, and then fed hot steam through a pipe. So you can still see the hole in the ground where the pipe was, because the building had underfloor heating and big boilers. So you could keep all those dishes, and you saw them on Carême's menu. Lots and lots and lots of them. You didn't need to eat all of them, but you had the choice. But, you know, the kitchen had to prepare them all, and to make sure they would all be at the right temperature or kept warm, you could put them on the steam table. And then you asked about the Decker's room. So between the magnificent kitchen, which, by the way, is on the ground floor and dangerously close to the staterooms, really unusual. Usually kitchens are in the basement or in another part of the estate, sometimes linked through a tunnel, as in Petworth House. No, dangerously close, but that gave you the opportunity to take the food through quickly. There was good ventilation, generally speaking, very good working conditions. But between the banqueting room and the kitchen is it's a little sort of space called the Decker's room, the table Decker's room, and that's basically an interim space. So the food comes out of the kitchen, and then the final touches are being added in the Decker's room, and then food is taken through.
So the food is dressed.
It's dressed. And Carême, and you mentioned that he had aspirations to be an architect. Yeah, absolutely. He creates, he creates pagodas and miniature pavilions as desserts, and puts them as centerpieces. Carême, of course, was theatrical in his art, and George was theatrical in his taste. So I think the two were probably a very good match. Carême wasn't very happy here. I think there's some rather scathing comments about certain English ways of preparing food. And nothing much has changed, it appears. He complains about too much water and not enough salt and things like that.
So he doesn't stick around?
He doesn't stay for very long, no, sadly. But it's a great story. We had him. He was here.
He goes back to France?
He goes back to France. Yeah.
And does George try to tempt him back?
I don't know. We don't know.
Yeah. Well, I hope it wasn't too much of a come down for George, and how difficult it must have been to find a replacement.
I think George made sure he had good food in this building.
The Royal Pavilion evolved in stages from George's time as Prince of Wales, and then the Prince Regent, and then finally his coronation as George IV. And there are these different layers of style. In fact, the whole building is kind of like the layers of an onion, one style within another. And it really is a remarkably layered edifice in other ways as well, because outside the spectacle and that dreamlike vista, there is, of course, a place where people actually lived and served and cared for each other and had lives.
Alexandra, beyond the grand spectacle, what more intimate and intriguing narratives do the private apartments and connecting galleries of the pavilion reveal about George IV and his world?
Because this was predominantly a party palace, or a pleasure palace, you might want to call it, all the emphasis is on the ground floor and the staterooms. So you have that wonderful sequence of very impressive entertaining spaces, shall we say. What is remarkable, though, about this building is that the style, the chinoiserie style, continues behind the scenes in the private apartments of the king, but also on the chamber floor. And the chamber floor, the upper floor of the pavilion, is complex because of the roofline that John Nash sort of introduced. And most of the rooms are very small and quite low. So you give it all up for the spectacular sort of roofline. So small rooms, and not many people were invited to stay. They tended to be close members of the family, some of his brothers, the dukes, high court officials, the occasional guest. But, you'd get kicked, but, most people would get kicked out at the end of a long evening after the banquet or a ball. But it continues in the same vein, and I find that extraordinary. So you go upstairs and it's the same spectacle, the same theatricality. And this is where George introduces the chrome yellow rooms in the ballrooms on the east side where his brothers would stay. So that is one thing. And then, of course, because we have these two building phases, Holland in the 18th century and then Nash transforming it in 1815, we have a lot of voids in the building. We have a lot of, people call them secret doors. They're actually jib doors, and sometimes they're there to actually give access to spaces that, you know, quick access, easy access. Sometimes it's little staircases to the upper floor. But often they are there for aesthetic reasons, so as not to break up the design of that particular wall.
So a jib door's like a door without a door frame that sort of looks like it isn't there.
Yeah, you don't see it. You don't see it.
I noticed in the music room.
Yes, in the music room we have jib doors and fake doors.
And they're fake doors, so
Fake
and they're
doors
right
as
next
well.
to each other as well.
Yes, they're right next to each other. And the reason for that is because it's a relatively small building, as royal residences go, because George was restricted here in Brighton. This was central Brighton, and he couldn't just, you know, extend endlessly. So he had to sort of use optical illusion and other devices to make you think the building is bigger than it is. So on the outside, Nash does it by putting shrubs and trees at either end of the building. So if you see it coming from, say, the west, you think, oh, it just goes on forever. But no, it stops there where the shrubs are. On the inside, it's the use of mirrors, of indirect lighting, of ley lights, sort of, you know, top-lit rooms, to sort of bewilder you, to make you think, oh, we don't quite know where this room is going. And in the case of the music room, it is also grand fake doors that give you the impression that you can open them and then what's called the enfilade, that sort of, you know, uninterrupted view through one side of the building, it will continue. There's another grand room behind there, but there isn't. There's a small room where the musicians gathered, and that's why you do need the little jib doors, which are to the left and the right of the organ, which is sort of sunk into the wall. It's just typical of George.
So he's sort of
and this
wanting
building.
to pretend that this could be a building that goes on forever, like Versailles, with these diminishing vistas that go on like kilometre after kilometre of mirrored wall, whatever. And it really struck me that these two rather sort of comparatively squat fake doors next, real jib doors next to these extravagant.
It's an illusion of space, but also it's an illusion of worlds. So, you know, you do imagine these doors opening, but in the same room we have these vistas of China. So literally windows into a world that most people would never see. Most people did not travel to China. George didn't, Nash didn't, the Craces didn't, Jones didn't. But here we have the images lifted from books and put on the walls, blown up as if you were looking into a Chinese landscape.
And so thinking about the more intimate spaces of the pavilion, where did George sleep?
Well, George's private apartments in the 1780s in Holland's Marine Pavilion were on the upper floor, looking east. So he probably got a bit of a glimpse of the sea. And later on, when John Nash transformed the building, he moved downstairs, just below where we are now, on the west side, the northwest part of the building. Ground floor, partly because that was also very much the style, you know, windows, it's open fully to the floor, and you have that connection with your garden or with the park. But he also moved downstairs because he couldn't really move that easily anymore by the later 18 teens, and he also had a huge bathroom installed just off, through one of those jib doors, off his bedroom. And when the future King of England creates a bathroom, it's not just any or bathroom. So it basically had a miniature pool, a plunge pool, several meters deep, fed with either hot or cold water, and also having steam contraptions, your own little steam room in that area. So that had to be ground floor, of course.
So he ended up having to move to the ground floor because of his health and mobility.
Yeah.
And so this idea that the pavilion was, or his move to Brighton was associated in his early days when he was a gallant about town, that it might be for a sea cure. There is a kind of irony that it ended up being very much towards the latter part of his life, refocused around what his body needed.
Yeah, he actually needed it. Yeah. And of course, he wouldn't sort of mix with the ordinary people on the beach to take the waters. He had his own shampooer, Shakuddin Mohammed, who had set up business, so he had a shampooing place. It was called shampooing.
So I'm thinking about an elaborate hairdo.
No. It meant being massaged, being advised how to take the waters. And Shakuddin Mohammed came here, so he was the royal shampooer. Spectacular figure, really.
From where?
Well, he had his own business near the beach. He had also opened, I think, the very first curry house earlier in London.
So he's Indian?
He's Indian, yeah. And he sort of, plays that role as he orientalizes himself to a certain extent for marketing purposes. Fascinating figure, absolutely fascinating figure. So he was here, and we have in our collection his complete outfit, which is a wonderful sort of combination of Indian features, but European tailoring.
So you mentioned shampooing, and this is a kind of massage. Did he sort of invent this?
I'm not quite sure who invented shampooing, but the whole culture of taking the waters of the seaside culture in England, that's developed from the earlier 18th century onwards. And it's a mistake to say George made Brighton famous as a seaside resort. He came because it was already popular. He clearly made it even more famous. But it was people like Dr. Russell, who put it all in writing and said, this is good for you. And not just swimming itself, but, gurgling the water and, also being massaged. It's basically exercise, fresh air, and salty water.
And there's a kind of, so Dr. Russell sounds like a slightly austere sort of figure, really, whereas personally, I think I'd rather have a shampoo. It sounds a lot more fun.
Yeah. Would have been very nice, being shampooed by Shakuddin Mohammed. Although, as a woman, I would probably have had a woman sort of treating me and lowering me into the water. They were called dippers, because most people couldn't swim.
Right.
So they would get help. You'd get into a bathing machine, which is basically a cart on wheels pulled into the water by donkeys or ponies, until you were in deep enough water to be lowered into the water. And there's fabulous cartoons showing people sort of struggling in the water.
Right. Well, brilliant. I wonder where the king's illegal wife is at this stage, or had things moved on with George's love life?
Oh God, they were always moving on. The stages of his love life. So I think, so he wasn't legally married to her in the eyes of the royal family and the Anglican Church, and he came under enormous pressure to produce an heir, i.e. to marry somebody respectable. And this person was indeed chosen by his parents, and this was Caroline of Brunswick, his first cousin, who was literally shipped in, so mail order bride. She had no choice in the matter. He had little choice, and it was hate at first sight. So he had to marry her in the 1790s, and they had never met before until she arrived, and they were married. They produced a child, but by the time the child was born, Princess Charlotte, they were already, no longer living together. He thought he had done his bit.
Yeah.
He had produced an heir to the throne, although it was only a girl, it would do. But very sadly, tragically, the daughter died in childbirth.
Right.
In 1817, before George died. So he did end up, despite his numerous affairs and marrying a woman he didn't want to marry, he left no legitimate heir.
And that's why his brother became king.
That's why William becomes king, but he also dies without an heir. And that is why Queen Victoria, their niece, comes to the throne.
Right.
She's the Duke of Kent's daughter, and ascends the throne in 1837 after William's death.
So in terms of then what happened to the pavilion after its flamboyant patron passed away in 1830, it goes first to his brother, William IV.
Yeah.
And I infer that George was close to his brother from what you've been saying because he was a guest here.
Yeah, yes.
And so did William, did he like a shampoo himself?
I think he did. He only reigned for 7 years, so we will never know what he, might have done.
And then there's this sort of rupture in terms of the direct inheritance somehow of the throne. So when Queen Victoria accedes to the throne, what does she think of it? What does she think of the pavilion? Is she a fan? Because it doesn't seem to me quite her vibe.
No, people always say that she hated it, but it's more complex than that. I think she disliked Brighton. She visits 4 or 5 times, I think 4 times, and she comes as a very young queen in 1838, and she is welcomed with open arms. So floral archways are built for her, because Brighton's very keen on the new queen. She comes with her favourite horse, and she tries to like it. Comes again, marries Albert, comes with her first 2 children, but something else is changing, and that's the way this country operates. The railways are being being created, and the line between London and Brighton opens in 1842, and that changes the demographics of Brighton. It changes who can come, who lives here. And Victoria doesn't like all these people following her, hounding her. And she's very exposed here, and you can tell by which rooms she chooses as bedrooms. She wants to be away from the prying eyes of the public, whereas George,
it's all about
liked
display.
being on display until the last years. But she hides away, and she eventually decides to sell the Royal Pavilion.
And who does she sell it to?
To the people of Brighton.
And how could they possibly afford such a magnificent edifice?
Oh, it wasn't expensive.
She sold it at a discount.
She sold it basically for the land value, the space, because everybody assumed that the building would be pulled down, and crucially, she had plans, great plans for Buckingham Palace. So she added that new wing, which basically closed off John Nash's courtyard, because she needed more space. And that needed to be A, financed, and B, furnished. So the money from the pavilion, which was only £50,000.
That sort of doesn't really sound like a lot.
No, not if, and this is 1845, not if you think that just decorating the music room of the Royal Pavilion in 1820 cost £50,000.
Well, that really does put it into perspective.
It really does. So it was a bargain. So the town commissioners of Brighton bought it after some debating, one should say, But of course, it was an empty shell of a building because Victoria had emptied it completely in the previous years.
Because she thought it would be knocked down?
Yeah, and because it was hers to take. I mean, you know, and this is my point. I think, especially once Albert is on the scene, we know Albert had a great interest in the decorative arts. He was instrumental in the great exhibition of 1851, of course, Crystal Palace. And they really liked the decorations. And we know this because she did take everything, also gave a lot back. But she, first of all, took everything, including the Chinese wallpaper, including all those paintings from the music room, including almost all the fireplaces, apart from that one. And reused much of it in Buckingham Palace.
So how did you get it all back?
We didn't. We didn't get it all back. It is still very much in that east wing of Buckingham Palace, and sometimes you can get a glimpse if the royal family steps onto the balcony. In that room behind,
you can spot a chandelier.
You spot the chandelier from the music room, or a chandelier from the music room. But we did get a lot of things back. Victoria returned very, very large objects and surfaces, such as all the red wall paintings. They're on canvas in the music room. They all came back. Most of the chandeliers came back on carts and then trains and then back. Yes.
And then came back again and went back up again.
Yeah.
That's
I know. I don't know how it survived, and you know, and a lot of things did get damaged. You know, yeah. It's, yeah,
I mean, the mind boggles.
A lot of crates were never opened because, you know, Victoria had no use for the things in them. So we did get a lot of things back under Victoria. And then subsequent monarchs have also been very, very supportive. The first freestanding objects came back just after World War I. And then her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II gave us many, many objects on long-term loan. So a lot of what you see is original. And in 2019, a major loan came from Buckingham Palace, temporary for just under 2 years, as was envisaged, of almost all the freestanding objects and some fixtures, while Buckingham Palace was resurfaced. So we had almost all the original mounted Chinese porcelain and furniture here that was here under George.
It must have been extraordinary.
It was extraordinary. And we needed John Nash's views, all
to
these
put it
images,
in the right place.
to know where to put things.
Of course.
So I was walking around with the images on an iPad.
Right.
Yeah.
And so who looks after the palace now? It's not a palace, the pavilion now.
The pavilion. Well, since 1850, it has been in municipal ownership, but since 2020, we are an independent trust. So until then it was council run, and now it's run by the Royal Pavilion and Museums Trust.
And so you're a charity?
We are a charity.
And how can people support the charity? Because this is a really important building,
It's really important, and it's so fragile and so complex and so important, really. Come and visit, support us. Museums are struggling generally post-COVID, post-Brexit and all that. So the best thing you can do is come and visit, spend time, spend money here, and spread the word.
So what single object should people make sure they see?
The dragon chandelier in the banqueting room. Look up and be amazed.
And what's your favourite room and why?
I think it is the music room. Because, although I'm a big Robert Jones fan who designed the saloon and the banqueting room, it was Frederick Race who was responsible for the music room. And I think it's that sort of magical interior, especially early in the morning, before people come in, or at certain times in winter when the sun is very low and you're maybe on your own in there and you look up and you get that real sense of magic with those lily-shaped chandeliers that appear to be floating above you. Wonderful.
Alexandra, after spending so much of your professional life in George IV's unique world here at the Royal Pavilion, has it affected in any way how you've decorated your own home?
I'm really embarrassed to say this, but I have no talent or great sense of interior decoration myself. I just can't do it. It's partly because I don't have the time, and also maybe I'm just too much in awe of people who are really good at this. I should really commission somebody to do it. So no, my walls are white. That's also very much because I'm from Germany, and there is a tradition of, especially if in an older building, just paint it white and then let the art speak. So I have a lot of art in my house, but I'm not great with colouring, I'm afraid. I shouldn't be saying this, but I'll leave that to the experts.
Yeah, wonderful. You don't then see yourself eyeing up a particularly flamboyant wallpaper pattern or even an onion dome and think, oh, yes.
Oh, I've got some offcuts of this wallpaper, and I'm trying to convince my husband whether we can have one feature wall of Chinese-inspired wallpaper in one of the rooms. I'll do that.
Yeah. Alexandra, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.